Member from Toronto Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker. My question to the Premier. The Premier is telling one story. She says she's selling 60% of Hydro One and the Liberals will keep 40%. But the legislation tells a very different story. The legislation specifically gets ready for the day when Ontario owns less than 10% of Hydro One. Can the Premier explain why she's preparing for Ontario to own less than 10% of Hydro One?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what the member opposite neglects to say is that we are building into this process and into this legislation decision-making authority, Mr. Speaker, that would protect the people of Ontario. So, any decision of that kind of magnitude, Mr. Speaker, would require two-thirds majority of the Hydro One Board of Directors, Mr. Speaker, which means that having 40% ownership, Mr. Speaker, protects us. Let me read the restriction on the province's sale. And this is from Bill 91, the Building Ontario Up Act, and it's section 48.2. The Minister, on behalf of Her Majesty in right of Ontario, shall not sell, dispose of, or otherwise divest any common shares of Hydro One Inc. if the sale, disposal, or divestment would result in the Minister, on behalf of Her Majesty in right of Ontario, owning a number of common shares that is less than 40% of the outstanding number of common shares of Hydro One Inc. Mr. Speaker.
Before I move to the supplementary question, the dialogue back and forth is continuing while someone on that side is putting a question, the talk, and somebody on this side giving the answer, the talk. Supplementary.
Thank you, Speaker. So the Premier has just set out her case, but, Speaker, the Premier has no mandate to sell Hydro One. That's not stopping her. She says she'll keep 40% of the privatized company, but the legislation sends a clear message. The Premier is getting ready for the day when Ontarians own less than 10% of Hydro One. Why is the Premier leaving the back door open so Ontarians could end up owning less than 10% of Hydro One?
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, let's just be clear that what underlies the question that the member has asked is an assumption that building transit and transportation infrastructure really isn't that important because he's not willing and his party is not willing to acknowledge that A, they ran on reviewing the assets of the province, Mr. Speaker. It was part of their platform. It was part of their assumptions, Mr. Speaker. And the fact is we are implementing what we ran on and what they ran on. The Ontario government will nominate 40% of the Hydro One board, will have the power to unilaterally dismiss the board, Mr. Speaker. That means that the government will have de facto veto on the board for a decision like the dissolution of the shares. Mr. Speaker, that's the reality. We're doing this so we can build transit and transportation infrastructure around the province.
Final supplementary.
The Premier still doesn't answer the question as to why the potential is set up in this bill for the province to own less than 10% of the shares. The Liberals say they'll keep 40% of a privatized Hydro One, but it's clear the Premier has left the door open to owning less than 10%. The Premier kept Ontarians in the dark about her plan to sell Hydro One during the last election. She doesn't have a mandate to sell off Hydro One, whether it leaves us with 40% or 4%. It's the wrong plan, and Ontarians are going to pay the price. Is the Premier trying to keep Ontarians in the dark about what her plan really means for Hydro One and for Ontario?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite once again is talking about the dilution of shares, and I will just read again what I said. The fact is that the Ontario government will nominate 40% of the Hydro One board and will have the power to unilaterally dismiss the board, Mr. Speaker. Any decision like that in terms of the dilution of the shares, Mr. Speaker, would require a vote of two-thirds of the board, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, would require that supermajority vote. So the fact is that that kind of decision would not be made because we would have 40% of the vote. But, Mr. Speaker, the cost of not investing in infrastructure, the cost of not investing in assets that are needed for the 21st century, that is the cost that we have to focus on, Mr. Speaker. We ran on a plan to find a way to make those investments that are going to allow this province to thrive. They don't want to do that in the third party. The party opposite doesn't want to do that, Mr. Speaker. We said we were going to do it, and that is exactly what we are doing.